Guys, what if I told you that our class exotic glaives were about to be meta? Nah, I'm just kidding. But they should be better, at least based on the notes Bungie gave us a few weeks ago. Now, if you don't know anything about these exotic glaives, that's alright. These class-specific exotic glaives were pretty much dead on arrival, even despite some of them having some pretty interesting exotic perks. But each one of these just came up short. However, in Season 17, all 3 class-specific glaives received a small buff. But to be quite honest with you guys, it didn't really push the needle, which brings us to the 2 questions we want to answer today. Number 1, will these buffs be enough to make players want to finally use these forgotten about exotics? And number 2, if so, which one? First, we need to touch on the reworked glaives coming next season, which will impact all glaives in the game, including our exotics. Bungie felt that in PvP, Impulse Amplifier felt mandatory, and in PvE, the damage felt underpowered compared to some of our other special ammo options. Now, to rectify this, glaive projectile speed is getting an increase by 30%, and projectile damage is getting increased in PvE by 25%. Now, to offset that projectile speed increase, the projectile damage inside of PvP is being decreased. But come on, how many of us are actually using glaives in PvP? Granted, if Weave Walk was still working with glaives, well, your man would definitely still be using them. But for my dedicated PvP glavers, yeah, this one's gonna hurt. You're not gonna be able to one-shot and then melee combo afterwards to get the kill. And don't even get me started on checkmates. Next up, Bungie is also reducing the delay after firing before you can melee from 0.75 seconds to 0.2 seconds. On paper, this seems like another substantial buff to glaives, and Bungie noted that they felt that this delay made glaives feel clunky and unintuitive to use, and I have to agree. When I would use a glaive, I would either lean into one thing or the other, buffing my projectile or buffing my melee damage, and not really using both in tandem with one another. Now, the last part of the rework is regarding their shields. Bungie is changing it so that shield energy will now recharge passively by 1% per second when holding your glaive. Again, another buff that is going to be a game changer here, and this is very similar to like swords, right? Because back in the day, you would only get sword charge from ammo, but Bungie separated those 2 things long ago. Now, 1% a second may not seem like a lot, but of course this does add up, and if you're dealing damage with a projectile, you'll still get that very fast charge. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a room, thought I had shield energy when I did not, and then died. Last thing regarding shields though, is that they've set up the base shield damage resistance to be tiered inside of PvP, with the base damage resistance at 50% and 30% damage resistance versus primary weapons and melee attacks. And again, I'm not that big on using glaives in PvP, and for my PvP players that do use glaives, feel free to let me know your thoughts, but this should definitely fix some of the frustration that players do feel when they come up against a glaive inside of PvP, as that damage resistance can feel pretty insane at times. Now, so far, we've only spoken about changes that are hitting all glaives. What we're going to dive into now are the reworks coming to the class-specific glaives, and if they can hang with our current meta options. So before discussing each exotic's individual change, outside of the general glaive changes I detailed a moment ago, there are some buffs that are happening across all 3 exotics. Those changes are: grant 1 ammo when you activate the perk, so you can use it even if you are out of ammo, and no longer passively drain shield energy when you special reload to activate the perk, and no longer deactivate it by reloading or stowing the weapon. Guys, these are massive changes. I know, on paper they seem subtle, but with these changes, I can actually see myself taking some of these exotic glaives into in-game content. We're going to discuss each one in just a second, but having our special effects on demand without having to worry about ammo or activating it at the wrong time means the ease of use for these exotics is going to skyrocket. So now, let's go over each of our class glaives' current functionality and individual upcoming buffs. I'm going to start with Edge of Action. This is our Titan Void Glaive. Its exotic perk reads: when weapon energy is full, consume it before firing to make your next shot deploy a protective shield on impact. And out of the 3 class glaives, Edge of Action here is the only one that intrinsically synergizes with our 3.0 subclasses. However, that is changing. We're going to touch on that in just a moment. But right now, when you drop this mini bubble, it actually gives you a Void Overshield, and it's a great way to stay safe within the heat of battle. The Void Overshield allows us to take advantage of our subclass, and the bubble works just like our Ward of Dawn, keeping us relatively safe within. Now, I already thought this exotic was decent, but for the most part, I think many Titans would just prefer to use their bubble and just use a different exotic weapon. Next season though, I think it could genuinely be meta here. Its upcoming changes read: passing through the bubble now grants bonus reload speed, handling, and a small amount of stacking bonus damage in addition to the overshield. Sounds good, right? But wait, there's kind of a drawback here. Bungie reduced the health of the bubble from 8,000 to 2,400 to account for the increase increase uptime and improve effects. Now, firstly, are you gonna feel that drop in health of your bubble? Well, it depends on the activity, right? Grandmaster Nightfalls? Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, guys, it's gonna be able to tank, but I can only imagine how much damage it could take from an unstoppable champion that runs up into your bubble and starts doing a slam attack, right? Combine that with a bunch of assets blowing their load on you. Again, this scales much higher and more difficulty content. Now, as for the big change though, the bubble will continue to mirror Ward of Dawn and will now improve our weapons similarly to how Weapons of Light does. Now, keep in mind, Bungie says right here, it's a small stacking damage bonus. We don't know how much this will be exactly, but hell, bonus damage is bonus damage. And when considering how easy this bubble will be to activate, you'll be able to keep these bonuses up pretty much at all times. I 100% see myself adding this to some of my own loadouts. Now, our next glaive is the Warlock exclusive glaive, Edge of Intent. This solar glaive's perk reads, when weapon energy is full, consume it before firing to make your next shot deploy a healing turret on impact. Now, currently, unlike our Titan glaive, this one absolutely has no synergy with our subclass. The effect of the healing turret is pretty nice, but with a cumbersome activation and lackluster build potential. There's a reason you don't see this glaive, but I'm happy to say this is changing. Edge of Intent's buff reads, change the effect of the healing turret projectiles to grant cure and provide restoration. Also increase the AoE radius to 8 meters to benefit more nearby allies. They're also increasing the magazine size from 4 to 5. Now, across the board, this exotic will be fulfilling its role much better. Switch its healing to be cure and restoration means that we can actually build into it. This also means off of one heal, a guardian can be brought to full health, which is much better than the chunk of health the turret grants now. And with that AoE being increased, this means our allies should get healed more often as well. Now, we've been slowly receiving more support exotics lately. Look no further than Navigator, our Strand Trace rifle. We even have an upcoming support frame auto rifle for the finer shape. But for my support players, you could use this. However, for my warlocks already rocking things like Lumina, Boots of the Assembler, it's tough, man. There's so many things you can do on demand with those exotic combos. Now, granted, if we're like in a dungeon next season and it's insanely difficult and we're like constantly losing health, well then maybe this exotic glaive would be useful. It's like back in the day when Ursa Furiosa Titans, no one even looked at using Banner inside of PvE. But then we had hard mode Menagerie, and overnight, Banner Titan with Ursa Furiosa was back. And I know, it was completely busted at launch, but then Bungie nerfed it and made it dependent on how much damage you tank. But the way that exotic and that super combo works was the harder the content, the stronger it was. It's a possibility, or at least I'm optimistically looking at Edge of Intent as that exotic that may be a necessity in those dire moments, in those moments where we need constant healing. Now, next up, we have our Hunter Arc Glaive, Edge of Concurrence. This glaive perk reads, when weapon energy is full, consume it before firing to make your next shot track targets across the ground and unleash Chain Lightning on impact. Now, this perk has always been underwhelming. Chain Lightning is cool and all, and it helps with ad clear, but it also has some major drawbacks. Number one, Chain Lightning has no Arc 3.0 synergy, and the ad clear capabilities are nowhere near as good as something like Forbearance with Chain Reaction, or even Trinity Ghoul, especially when considering that currently you need to expend 5 special ammo to activate this one effect. But some of these pain points are being alleviated next season. Edge of Concurrence's change reads, Lightning Seeker now jolts targets on impact. Reduce the direct hit damage of Lightning Seeker to account for the free ammo granted. Now, next season, this glaive will finally be able to dip into Arc 3.0 with jolts. This, of course, means that Edge of Concurrence will now be able to stun overload champions. And the question is this actually enough to push this weapon into favorable territory? Sure, it takes less ammo to activate, and it jolts now. But as I just said, Forbearance, which is a legendary weapon, pretty much does everything that Edge of Concurrence does, but better. What sucks about this change, though, is that they're nerfing the impact damage of the Seeker. And with Jolt specifically, I fear that having Jolt applied from the Seeker alone will leave a lot to be desired. If the Chain Lightning also applied Jolts, I could see this exotic becoming a pretty good option, as the Chain Lightning already one-shots red bars. Hopefully, Bungie is generous with the Jolt damage here, and Concurrence can spread into anything it touches. But if it doesn't go this route, I doubt many people will be trying this weapon. So to circle back to the questions that we asked earlier, are these changes enough to use these glaives? Well, for us, absolutely. We're gonna be using them pretty much day one. I gotta know, man. I need to see what it synergizes with. I wanna know how much of a damage buff we get from our Titan glaive. If the Chain Lightning with our Hunter glaive is actually super nasty and can clear a room, then fellas, I'll eat my words. But as of now, the only one that's really standing out to me is Edge of Action. Now, Now, Bungie gives us like a 2% buff, then that's gonna suck. But it is nice having a bubble pretty much on you at all times, which is what you're gonna be able to accomplish with Edge of Action. And keep in mind, one of the coolest synergies is that Helm of Saint 14 works with the bubble from Edge of Action. But Cross, you're only saying this exotic is good because you're a Titan. Look, I'm ready to be proven wrong. Who knows? Maybe Edge of Intent is gonna rule the Warlock meta next season. Either way, I'm glad that some love has been given to these exotics. It's a shame that they have been as bad as they have been. Hopefully, with the love that's being shown here, they'll finally make their way into some of our loadouts. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.